Thoroughly debunk claims made in Shashi Tharoor's book Inglorious Empire. Will Durant in his book The Story of Civilization presented India as a once flourishing civilization brought low by Britain's economic plundering during the colonial era, supporting the drain theory promoted by Indian nationalists. Shashi Tharoor frequently quotes in his book that in the 18th century, India accounted for 23% of the world economy, as large as Europe combined. By the time the British left, it had dropped to 3% or 4%. Tharoor argues Britain's rise was financed by depredations in India, summarizing the drain theory. In 1700, based on early GDP estimates, India, China, and Western Europe each accounted for about 23% of world GDP. India's share dramatically declined over the next centuries while Europe's rose rapidly. British economist Angus Maddison challenged the 23% figure using more accurate historical GDP data. His statistics showed India, China and Europe were not equal in 1700 as claimed by nationalists. Other academics like Indian economist Tirthankar Roy further analyzed fiscal flows and found the drain theory unsubstantiated. British extraction did not severely impoverish India as argued. Modern economic analyses show British services and investments did not massively extract wealth from India contrary to nationalist claims. The statistics do not support this argument. British industrialization and technology, not deliberate destruction, impacted India's textile industry. India failed to industrialize while Britain innovated. India's inability to industrialize stemmed from internal societal weaknesses in Tharoor's telling, not British exploitation as some nationalist historians claim. Tharoor praises Mughal India but ignores issues like religious intolerance, overspending, weak rulers that contributed to the empire's decline. Tharoor ignores India's long-standing caste system and social constraints that hampered development. He falsely implies British invented discriminatory aspects of Hindu society. In summary, modern data-based economic analyses contradict Tharoor's sweeping drain theory claims. The real drivers of India's changing fortunes were complex, not just British extraction. Here are some criticisms of the drain theory presented in Shashi Tharoor's book Inglorious Empire, along with counter-arguments. Tharoor claim, Britain drained India of its wealth through unfavorable trade policies and imbalanced tariffs. This impoverished India. Critique, trade deficits do not necessarily make a country poorer. India's global trade share remained steady even as Britain's increased. Falling share of world GDP was likely due to India missing the Industrial Revolution, among other factors. Tharoor claim, British policies destroyed India's globally dominant textile industry and converted India into a raw material supplier. Critique, India's textile industry was already declining and Britain's rising due to technological innovations like the spinning jenny. Steam power and market access gave Britain key advantages. Blaming British policies overlooks underlying technological and economic drivers. Tharoor claim, British taxation and exploitation siphoned off India's wealth. India was treated as a revenue cow to fund Britain's wars. Critique, evidence does not support massive extraction of Indian wealth to Britain. Taxation rates moderate compared to Indian rulers. Military costs offset by security benefits. Complex two-way capital flows don't support simplistic drainage narrative. Tharoor claim, remittances from British officials in India were a form of tribute levied on the Indian economy. Critique, individual remittances do not equate to national-level extraction. British officials spent large part of salaries within India, stimulating economy. Net remittances were small relative to trade volumes and GDP. In summary, modern economic analyses show the drain theory is overly simplistic. The real drivers of India's changing economic fortunes were complex, involving global trade patterns, industrialization forces, and social factors. Sweeping claims of British extraction do not match the empirical realities. Shashi Tharoor is an Indian politician known for polemical, one-sided attacks against British rule in India. His arguments contain flaws and omissions. Tharoor claims railways were just another instrument for British plunder of India. This misrepresents reality through selective facts. Part about 5% shareholder guarantee is true. However, realized returns were much lower, contradicting exploitation claim. Returns on Indian rail securities matched those on British rail securities. Not evidence of unilateral extraction. Shareholders earned higher returns on Western Hemisphere railroads, debunking excessive profit allegation. Average returns on major Indian rail securities were just 3.7%, not indicative of exploitative levels. Tharoor claims railways only served British interests, not native welfare. Scholarly research disproves this. Rail infrastructure enabled vital grain trade, reducing devastating famines in multiple studies. Railroads increased trade volumes and reduced price volatility per academic research. Agricultural incomes rose approximately 16% on average after railroad construction per economic study. Government policy was to develop an integrated rail system despite unprofitability of many lines. Railways enabled grain to move from surplus to scarcity areas, reducing volatile prices and famine. Passenger traffic exploded from 19 million in 1871 to over 1 billion in 1946, indicating public utilization. Railways saved 1 billion rupees or 9% of national income in transport costs by 1900, a huge economic gain. Guarantees to rail investors cost only 0.2–0.3% of national income, contradicting excessive profit claims. Tharoor repeats factually incorrect claims despite decades of evidence rebutting his arguments. His popular polemics propagate myths about alleged British exploitation post-independence. Ignores benefits like infrastructure development, administrative institutions, and social reforms. Disregards Orientalist contribution to preserving and disseminating knowledge of ancient Indian texts. Paints simplistic, exaggerated picture of pre-colonial India as prosperous and enlightened. Romanticizes Indian rulers like the Marathas, ignoring their extractive, predatory practices. Ignores long-standing issues like caste and gender oppression, lacking historical context. Falsely implies British maliciously invented discriminatory aspects of Hindu social structure. Discounts positive impacts of reformers who opposed practices like sati widow burning. Simplistically blames British for partition without considering pre-existing communal tensions. Minimizes Muslim League separatism while exaggerating Congress's secularist platform. Rejects nuance regarding indirect British rule utilizing Indian intermediaries for most administration. Ignores instances of British advocacy against slavery, caste oppression, gender inequality on human rights grounds. Disregards British role in suppressing practices like thugi, ritual murder, female infanticide, and human sacrifice. Rejects substantial regional collaborator role, falsely implying nationwide anti-colonial consensus. Falsely implies corruption was exclusively a British import into previously incorrupt India. Simplistically glorifies Gandhi's movement, ignoring negative impacts on marginalized groups. Cherry-picks quotes from Orientalists like Macaulay to portray them as uniformly racist. Falsely implies British policies uniformly destroyed India's economy, disregarding many complex factors. Exaggerates unity and impact of pre-independence movements like Swadeshi. Regional and class divides existed. Ignores instances of British support for progressive social reforms like inter-caste marriage legalization. Disregards British advocacy against landlord exploitation of peasants. Falsely implies Hindu-Muslim unity against British when communal divisions led to partition. Fails to recognize British role in unifying country into common administrative system. Makes unprovable counterfactual claims about India's hypothetical prosperity without British imperialism. In summary, Tharoor peddles nationalistic historical myths contrasting innocent India with evil British oppressors. Reality was far more complex, with both positive and negative aspects of colonial rule. Sweeping generalizations do not accurately portray the nuanced impacts of imperialism in India. Here are some quotes from Indian historians and economists countering claims made by Shashi Tharoor in his book Inglorious Empire. Amartya Sen. The picture of pre-British India that Tharoor presents is distorted. Tharoor exaggerates the economic contrasts between British and pre-British India. Tirthankar Roy. Tharoor's idea that India contributed 23%, or more than a fifth, of the world economy before the British arrived is based on shoddy scholarship and nationalist exaggeration. Zarir Masani. Tharoor peddles simplistic theories about the extraction of wealth from India to Britain. The reality was far more complex. Patrick French. Tharoor is on shaky ground when he alleges the British deliberately wrecked the Indian economy and society for imperial gain. There is little evidence for this. Niall Ferguson. The notion that the British impoverished India is self-evidently absurd. India's real income probably rose by about 1% a year between 1870 and 1930. Vishnupriya Gupta. Tharoor's narrative exaggerates the drain theory and glosses over the complexities of imperial financial arrangements. John Wilson. Tharoor's book presents a cartoon version of imperialism and slides into crude cultural essentialism. Srinath Raghavan. Inglorious Empire is bedeviled by selective use of facts and ignoring or suppressing inconvenient data that does not fit with its main thesis. Gyan Prakash. Presenting pre-colonial India as prosperous ignores issues like famines. And Tharoor exaggerates British destruction of cottage industries. In summary, many respected Indian scholars challenge Tharoor's sweeping portrayal of rapacious British exploitation and idyllic pre-colonial prosperity as lacking nuance and unsupported by historical evidence. They point to weaknesses in his scholarship and nationalist bias.